On a day when nothing seemed out of the ordinary, when the world felt still and safe, one woman had no idea that within hours, her backyard would become the center of a 911 emergency. This is where the story begins. Quietly, almost too quietly, the afternoon sun hung lazily in the sky, its warm light spilling across Emily Carter's backyard. The air smelled faintly of freshly cut grass, and a gentle hum of bees drifted from the flower beds she had so carefully tended. Her backyard was her sanctuary, a place where she could escape the noise of the outside world. Today was no different. A wicker chair sat under the shade of a large oak tree, and Emily was curled up in it with a paperback novel, a half-finished cup of chamomile tea resting on the small table beside her. She turned the pages slowly, not in a rush to finish, just savoring the rhythm of the afternoon. From the wooden fence to the low stone wall at the back, the yard was an inviting mix of green and color. Pansies, roses, and lavender framed the edges, while a neat vegetable patch occupied the far right corner. Emily's hand still bore faint traces of soil from her morning's work, but she didn't mind. To her, that was the mark of a day well spent. A light breeze lifted a strand of her hair, carrying with it the scent of honeysuckle from a neighbor's trellis. In the distance, she could hear the faint sound of children playing on the other side of the street. Emily glanced toward the old maple tree near the back fence. 2 years ago, she had hung a swing there for her niece, Lily, who visited every other weekend. The swing swayed gently now, moved only by the wind, its ropes creaking softly. It made her smile. For someone who had spent most of her adult life in a bustling city apartment, moving here to the suburbs had been a leap of faith, but one she never regretted. Life here was quieter, slower, and for Emily, that was exactly what she needed. She leaned back, closing her eyes for a moment, letting the sunlight warm her face. She could hear the faint rustle of the leaves above, the distant barking of a dog, and the rhythmic squeak of a screen door opening and shutting from the house next door. Mrs. Peters, her elderly neighbor, was likely stepping out to feed her cats again. That was the thing about this neighborhood. You could set your watch by the little routines. No one was in a hurry, and everyone seemed to know everyone else's habits without ever needing to ask. From her seat, Emily could see her neighbor, Jack Turner, crouched beside his driveway, fiddling with his motorcycle. He looked up briefly, waved, and Emily returned the gesture. Jack was in his mid-40s, quiet but kind, the sort of neighbor who helped shovel snow without being asked in winter and returned borrowed tools the very same day. The interactions here were simple and genuine, nothing like the fast, anonymous exchanges she'd grown used to in the city. Her phone buzzed lightly on the table beside her. It was a message from her sister, asking how her weekend was going. Emily smiled, typing back quickly. Perfect weather, quiet day, nothing exciting at all. She didn't realize at the time just how much those words would feel like a lie later. She took another sip of tea, now lukewarm, and listened to the world around her. Somewhere a lawnmower started up, its drone blending into the background. A delivery van rattled down the street and stopped 2 houses over, the driver hopping out with a small package. It was a kind of Saturday afternoon that felt like it could stretch forever, suspended in a bubble where nothing bad could possibly intrude. Emily's gaze drifted to the top of the oak tree, where sunlight dappled through the leaves. The patterns on the ground shifted slowly with the breeze. She had lived here for only 3 years, but she already knew the seasons by heart. The way spring painted the grass a brighter green, how summer filled the air with the scent of wildflowers, and the way autumn turned every leaf into a flame of orange and red. This backyard had been witness to so many quiet moments, laughter over weekend barbecues, early morning coffee, while dew still clung to the grass, an occasional lazy afternoon nap in the hammock. A car passed slowly down the street, the driver offering a friendly wave. Emily raised her hand in return. That was another thing about living here. People noticed each other. They didn't just speed past with their eyes on their phones. They made small human connections. It was part of the charm, part of what made her feel safe. She set her book down for a moment and stretched, the wicker chair creaking softly beneath her. The sky was an endless pale blue with only a handful of clouds drifting lazily overhead. Emily thought about what she might make for dinner later. Maybe a simple pasta with fresh basil from her garden. It was the kind of day where plans didn't need to be set in stone. She could take things as they came. From the corner of her yard, a small robin landed on the fence post. Its feathers puffed out in the sunlight. Emily watched as it hopped along the rail, pausing to tilt its head toward her before flying off. Even the wildlife seemed at ease here, unbothered by human presence. She stood and walked toward the vegetable patch, inspecting the tomatoes. They were ripening nicely, plump and red against the green vines. She brushed her fingers across one and smiled. A few steps away, the basil leaves shimmered in the light, their scent filling the air as she pinched a sprig. This was her favorite part of the day. Small, simple rituals that grounded her. As she moved back toward her chair, she noticed Mrs. Peters had taken a seat on her own porch, a wide-brimmed hat shading her face. They exchanged another wave. Emily thought briefly about going over to chat, but decided against it. She was too comfortable here. And besides, she would see Mrs. Peters later at the neighborhood book club meeting. She sat down again, flipping to the next chapter of her novel. The story was good, though she wasn't in any rush. The sun was still warm, and the hours felt generous. She had no reason to check the time. Her weekend was her own. If anyone had told her that within a short span, this peaceful scene would shatter under flashing lights and the urgent footsteps of strangers, she would have laughed it off. This was a safe place, a quiet place, and nothing, at least in her mind, could disturb that. But somewhere, far beyond her hearing, events were already set in motion, events that would draw the focus of the entire street to her very backyard. For now, though, Emily remained blissfully unaware, lost in the comfort of her perfectly ordinary day. Emily was halfway through a page in her novel when she noticed a faint sound cutting through the stillness. At first, she barely registered it. Just a thin wail somewhere far away, muffled enough to blend with the distant hum of life beyond her quiet street. She paused for a second, listening, then shrugged and returned to her book. Sirens were nothing unusual in the city, but here in the suburbs, they were rare, and when they did pass through, they were gone in minutes. But the sound didn't fade. Instead, it swelled, the high-pitched wail rising and falling in a steady rhythm, each crest just a little louder than the one before. Emily looked up again, her brow furrowing. The bees still buzzed around her flowers. The swing still swayed lazily under the oak, but the air felt different. Somewhere in the background, a dog began to bark, sharp and insistent. A second dog joined in, then a third, the chain of barks stretching down the block like a warning line. Emily set her book down on the table and leaned back in her chair, tilted her head to listen more closely. The siren was closer now, no longer a faint threat in the distance, but a clear, urgent cry. She stood and walked a few steps toward the front of the yard, peering past the side of her house toward the street. Across the way, she saw a curtain shift in the Peters' front window. Mrs. Peters' cat darted off the porch, startled by the noise. Jack Turner, still crouched by his motorcycle, straightened and wiped his hands on a rag, his eyes narrowing as he listened. A couple of children who had been riding bikes near the corner stopped pedaling and turned toward the sound. Their mother's voice carried over, calling them inside. The sirens were joined now by another, lower, heavier, the deep mechanical growl of a large vehicle accelerating. It reminded Emily of the fire trucks she'd seen only in passing on busy roads. Her mind began to tick through possibilities. A car accident on the highway, maybe, or a medical emergency at one of the houses a few streets over. The odd thing was that the sound didn't seem to be passing by. It was coming closer, weaving its way directly toward their block. Emily stepped out from her backyard gate and into the driveway, shielding her eyes from the sun as she looked down the street. The wail was loud now, echoing between the houses, and flashes of red and blue reflected faintly off a distant window. She could see neighbors stepping onto porches, hands shading their faces in the same way she was. The usual lazy weekend murmur of the neighborhood had shifted into something else, an alert, a shared curiosity, maybe even a stark concern. The first vehicle appeared at the far end of the street, a police cruiser with lights blazing, weaving through parked cars at controlled but urgent speed. Right behind it, another followed, and in the distance, Emily thought she saw the taller frame of an ambulance. The sound was no longer just loud. It pressed into the air, vibrating in her chest. Jack glanced over at her, his eyebrows raised. "Wonder what's going on," he called across the short stretch of lawn between their houses. Emily shook her head, her lips pressing into a thin line. She didn't have an answer. The cruiser slowed slightly as it reached the midpoint of the street, its siren cutting off abruptly, replaced by the squawk of the radio inside. The second cruiser did the same, pulling in close behind it. For a heartbeat, it seemed as if they might stop at one of the houses there. But then, with sudden purpose, both cars rolled forward again, straight toward Emily's end of the block. She felt a subtle tightening in her chest. Things like this didn't happen here. Not in the 3 years she'd lived on this street. Not in the middle of the Saturday afternoon filled with tea and garden work. She took a step back toward the gate, glancing once more toward her peaceful backyard, as if it might reassure her that whatever was happening had nothing to do with her. But the sirens, the lights, and the speed of those vehicles told a different story. And with each passing second, they were closing the distance between themselves and her front door. The wail of sirens grew louder until it filled every corner of Emily's quiet suburban street. Red and blue lights danced against her living room walls, flickering through the blinds like a storm of color. She moved to the front window, her bare feet silent on the hardwood floor, just in time to see the lead police cruiser screech to a halt at the mouth of her driveway. Behind it, another patrol car slid into place, and an ambulance rolled up seconds later, its headlights slicing through the early evening haze. The first officer barely waited for the car to stop before flinging his door open and stepping out, his hand already on the radio clipped to his shoulder. Another followed close behind, speaking quickly into a headset, his eyes scanning her property with laser focus. The back doors of the ambulance burst open, revealing 2 paramedics in bright jackets, their equipment bags swinging at their sides as they jogged toward the gate leading to her backyard. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, unsure whether to step outside or retreat inside. She wanted answers, but something about their urgency made her hesitate. None of them even looked her way. Their attention was locked on whatever was happening behind her house. The clink of the backyard gate, latch being thrown open, snapped her out of her daze. She stepped forward. "Excuse me, what's going on?" she called out, but her voice was swallowed by the sound of another set of sirens approaching in the distance. One officer paused for only half a second, just enough to glance at her, before muttering, "Stay inside, ma'am," and hurrying after the others. That phrase, "stay inside," sent a shiver through her. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command. She leaned against the doorframe, craning her neck to see past the gate, but from her position she could only make out the bobbing beams of flashlights and the shadowy movements of uniforms. She thought she heard a muffled shout, followed by the metallic rattle of equipment being set down on the grass. Another cruiser pulled up, and this time a tall man in plain clothes stepped out. His badge hung from a chain around his neck, and his expression was tight, controlled, but urgent. He spoke briefly to one of the uniformed officers before heading in the same direction as the rest, straight for her backyard. Emily's mind raced. Had there been an accident? A break-in? An animal attack? She tried to piece together the possibilities, but nothing made sense. She glanced over at her phone, which was still sitting on the coffee table from earlier. Should she call someone? But who? The faint static of radio chatter reached her ears. North Fence, possible entry point, keep perimeter secure. The words were clipped professional and not meant for her ears. Curiosity gnawed at her until she could no longer stand still. She stepped out onto the porch, the cool air brushing against her skin. The smell of exhaust from the running engines mixed with the faint scent of damp earth from the backyard. The street, usually filled with the sound of kids playing and neighbors chatting, was eerily quiet, save for the hum of emergency vehicles. Her neighbor, Mrs. Callahan, was standing on her lawn across the street, her bathrobe pulled tightly around her. She caught Emily's eye and mouthed, "What happened?" Emily shook her head, mouthing back, "I don't know." A sharp burst of light caught her attention. Someone had turned on a portable floodlight near the back gate. The sudden illumination spilled over the fence, casting long shadows and making the trees behind her property look like looming figures. Emily felt her pulse quicken. Something was definitely wrong. She could feel in the way the officers moved. No wasted motion, no casual glances, just sharp, deliberate actions. One of the paramedics reappeared for a moment, jogging back to the ambulance to retrieve a stretcher. Emily's stomach tightened. That meant someone was hurt, or worse. The plainclothes officer returned briefly, stepping through the gate with a phone pressed to his ear. He scanned the yard before his gaze locked on Emily. For a moment, he seemed to consider speaking to her, but then he turned away, continuing his conversation in low, urgent tones. She took a tentative step off the porch. The gravel in the driveway crunched under her foot. But before she could take another, the first officer she'd seen earlier moved into her path. His hand rested casually, but firmly on his holster. "Ma'am," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument, "please go back inside." Emily opened her mouth to protest, to demand an explanation, but the words stalled. Something in his eyes, professional but edged with caution, made her retreat. She backed toward the door, her mind spinning with unanswered questions. From inside, she watched as the stretcher disappeared behind the fence. Moments later, a flurry of movement erupted, officers converging, flashlights swinging wildly, sharp commands being shouted. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, urgent, almost panicked. Then came a sound that sent her heart hammering, a single loud crack, like a gunshot, splitting the night. The once quiet backyard now pulsed with restless movement. Flashlight beams sliced through the dark, sweeping over every patch of grass, every bush, every shadow that dared to move. The hum of crickets was drowned out by the crackle of police radios, spitting out terse codes that meant nothing to Emily but made the officers around her stiffen or change direction. Boots crunched against gravel, and the air smelled faintly of damp soil mixed with the metallic tang of adrenaline. Two paramedics had set up near the patio table, unpacking their bags with calm precision. They laid out equipment on a folded blanket, a blood pressure cuff, gauze, oxygen tanks, each item catching a brief gleam of flashlight before vanishing into shadow again. Their quiet, efficient movements stood in stark contrast to the jittery urgency of the officers pacing the yard. Emily stood frozen near the back steps, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She felt like a spectator in her own life, watching strangers take over the space she'd once used for barbecues and lazy summer afternoons. A floodlight was switched on, bathing the entire yard in a harsh, artificial glow that made the familiar trees look like stage props. From the corner of her eye, she noticed Mrs. Cartwright and Mr. Hill from next door leaning against the shared fence. They whispered in low, urgent tones, their breath curling in the cool air. Every so often, their eyes darted to Emily, then quickly away, as if afraid to meet her gaze. She could almost feel their curiosity pressing against her like a weight, the kind that demanded answers she didn't have. An officer near the back gate barked something into his radio, and three others immediately converged on the spot. One knelt to inspect the ground while the others scanned the perimeter. Emily wanted to ask what they were looking for, but her voice felt trapped somewhere in her chest. She sensed the tension was growing, stretching thin like a wire about to snap. The rustling of leaves drew her attention to the far corner of the yard. A young officer with a sharp jawline and a flashlight clenched between his teeth was pulling aside a cluster of overgrown vines. Another officer joined him, and together they tugged until the tangled greenery gave way, revealing the weather-worn boards of an old garden shed. Emily hadn't been inside it for years. She'd almost forgotten it was even there. "Ma'am," one of the officers called to her without turning around. "Do you have a key to this?" She shook her head slowly. "No, I don't think it even locks anymore." He tested the handle. It rattled but didn't open. Another officer stepped forward with a pry bar, wedged it against the doorframe, and pushed hard until it groaned and splintered. The door swung open, releasing a faint, musty smell. Flashlights cut into the darkness, revealing stacks of old gardening tools, rusted cans of paint, and a jumble of boxes Emily barely recognized. The officer stepped inside carefully, his light sweeping across the walls. Emily held her breath. There was a sharp intake of air from inside the shed, followed by a muffled curse. "What is it?" another officer asked. "Could be something," the first one replied, voice tight. Two more officers moved in, and Emily caught glimpses of them crouching, lifting something heavy, their silhouettes jerking in the narrow beam of light. The radios crackled again, this time with clipped phrases she didn't understand but could feel in the pit of her stomach. A murmur rippled through the neighbors at the fence. Mrs. Cartwright's hand flew to her mouth. Mr. Hill muttered something under his breath. Emily's pulse pounded in her ears. Whatever they'd found, it wasn't nothing. One of the officers emerged from the shed, holding a large black duffel bag. Its zipper was half open, and inside she glimpsed something wrapped tightly in plastic. He didn't let anyone get too close before handing it off to another officer, who immediately carried it toward the side gate, where a patrol car was waiting. The paramedics paused their quiet preparations to watch. Even they seemed to recognize that the tone of the scene had shifted. Emily stepped forward, her voice shaky. What is that?" The officer didn't answer, just gave her a brief, unreadable look before turning away. That silence was louder than any explanation could have been. In the background, the sound of more vehicles pulling up filled the air. Doors slammed and new uniforms entered the yard, their faces set with focused determination. The controlled chaos had escalated into something sharper, more deliberate. Emily glanced at the fence again. Now more neighbors had gathered, drawn by the flashing lights and the strange electricity in the air. Some held phones, their camera lenses glinting in the floodlight. She imagined her backyard already appearing on social media feeds, strangers speculating about her life without knowing a single true detail. Her mind churned with questions about the shed, the bag, the sudden urgency, but each time she tried to form them into words, she faltered. The only thing she knew for certain was that the night had shifted from unsettling to dangerous, and she was standing at the center of it. Somewhere in the yard, an officer's radio crackled again, sharper this time. Emily caught only fragments. "Perimeter secure, moving in." Her stomach twisted. Whatever they were moving in on, it was close. The backyard that had once been her safe haven now felt like enemy territory. Every corner was lit up and exposed, every movement scrutinized. Emily stood very still, listening to the hum of radios, the shuffle of boots, and the low murmur of neighbors, waiting for a moment when the tension would finally break. The sudden shout cracked through the humid afternoon like a whip, jolting Emily out of her daze. She had been standing near the driveway, her hands clenched so tightly the nails dug crescents into her palms. The sound came from the far corner of the property, right where the yard faded into the dense fringe of the woods. A chorus of heavy boots pounded against the grass as officers surged toward the noise, their radios crackling with overlapping voices. Emily instinctively moved forward, but a uniformed officer raised an arm, stopping her with a silent but firm barrier. She craned her neck, trying to see past a cluster of dark blue uniforms, and caught a fleeting glimpse, a shape on the ground, lying unnaturally still. It was too far to make out features, but she could see the pale skin of an exposed arm motionless in the shade. One officer crouched low, his gloved hand reaching toward the figure, while another barked something into his shoulder mic. The air felt heavier, as though the entire street was holding its breath. The paramedics appeared almost instantly, as if they had been waiting just out of sight. Their bright red gear stood out starkly against the muted greens and browns of the yard. They moved with practiced urgency, wheeling a stretcher across the grass, while another unzipped a medical kit and snapped on fresh gloves. Emily caught fragments of their low, clipped speech. No pulse yet, possible trauma, airways clear. The crowd of onlookers, which had grown since morning, fell into a strange, respectful hush. Even the chatter from the two men leaning on the fence evaporated mid-sentence. A dog somewhere down the street barked once, sharply, then stopped, as if sensing the tension in the air. Emily's heartbeat thundered in her ears, but her breathing slowed, heavy and deliberate. One of the paramedics tilted the figure's head back, while another pressed a mask of a portable resuscitator over their mouth. A mechanical hiss accompanied each compression. Emily could see the rise and fall of the chest. Forced, not natural. The officers formed a wide semicircle around them, their eyes scanning the tree line, not the patient, as if expecting something or someone to emerge from the shadows. Emily's mind raced, connecting dots she wasn't even sure were related. The missing man, the strange noises last night, the officer's tense expression earlier that morning, and now this. She found herself taking an involuntary step forward, but the same officer from before blocked her again, this time leaning down just enough to murmur, "Ma'am, please, stay back." The man's tone wasn't unkind, but it carried a weight that left no room for argument. Emily nodded, swallowing hard. She turned her gaze toward the woods. The dense foliage looked deceptively still, but she thought she caught movement, a shifting of leaves where there shouldn't be wind. Her skin prickled. The paramedics worked for several minutes that felt like hours. At one point, Emily thought she saw a twitch in the patient's hand, but when she blinked, it was gone. A few neighbors whispered to each other from across the street, but the words didn't carry. The air felt thick, pressing down like an invisible hand. Finally, one of the medics glanced up at an officer and gave a short, sharp shake of his head. The officer's jaw tightened. Without speaking, they loaded the figure onto the stretcher, securing the straps with mechanical clicks. A white sheet fluttered briefly in the breeze before being pulled over the still form. The silence deepened, so complete Emily could hear the faint rustle of grass under the medic's boots. Someone in the crowd let out a quiet sob. An elderly woman clutched her husband's arm, her eyes wet and unfocused. As the stretcher began to move, Emily felt a tug inside her chest, an irrational urge to follow, to demand answers right there and then. But the sight of the officers' tense stances rooted her to the spot. This wasn't over. The way they scanned the shadows, the way their hands hovered near their holsters, they were bracing for something else. A sudden crack from the woods, a branch snapping under weight, made several officers turn in unison. One drew his weapon, the metallic sound of it leaving the holster cutting through the air. Emily's breath caught, but nothing emerged. The silence returned, heavier than before. The paramedics disappeared around the side of the house, the stretcher's wheels bumping against uneven ground. Emily shifted her weight from foot to foot, her gaze locked on the tree line. The shade seemed darker now, almost impenetrable. From somewhere deep within the woods came a faint, low hum, too faint for most to hear over the distant rumble of the departing ambulance. But Emily heard it, and something about it made her skin crawl. She didn't know it yet, but this wasn't the end of the discovery. It was the beginning. The uniformed officer's eyes were sharp, even though his voice stayed measured. "Ma'am, can I have a word with you over here?" Emily glanced toward the pool area where the others had gathered, then back at the officer. She didn't like the way his gaze held hers, firm, probing, like he was already weighing her answers before she spoke them. She stepped a few feet away, just far enough that the low hum of voices behind them faded. The sun had shifted, casting a long shadow from the edge of the patio across the concrete. "Is there a problem?" she asked, trying to keep her tone casual. "Just a few questions," he replied. "You've been here since this morning?" "Yes," she said, nodding quickly. "Have you had any visitors? Delivery trucks? Maintenance workers?" His words were clipped, precise. Emily thought for a second. "No, I don't think so. Well, the landscaper came by yesterday, but not today." He wrote something down in a small notepad, then looked up. "How about any unfamiliar cars parked near the gate? People on foot?" Her stomach tightened. "I'm not sure. I wasn't exactly keeping watch." His pen paused over the paper. "And you haven't noticed anyone taking photos of the property? Hanging around longer than they should?" Emily shook her head slowly, but the question unsettled her. "Why? What's going on?" Instead of answering directly, the officer studied her for a moment, his brow furrowing slightly. "It's probably nothing," he said finally, but there was no conviction in his tone. "We're just trying to understand the sequence of events." Sequence of events. The phrase lodged in her mind, heavy and deliberate. Another officer passed behind them, speaking quietly into a radio. From the corner of her eye, Emily could see one of the detectives talking to security guard at the main gate. She caught fragments of their conversation, words like timing access and logs. Emily's throat felt dry. "You think this isn't random, don't you?" she asked, her voice lower now. The officer didn't answer right away. Instead, he clicked his pen close and slipped it into his pocket. "We're keeping all possibilities open," he said. But his tone made it clear there was one possibility they were focusing on more than the others. "What does this have to do with me?" she asked, the unease curling tighter inside her. He hesitated, then took a half step closer, lowering his voice. "We have reason to believe the people who came here knew exactly who they were looking for." The words hit her like a cold wind. "Me? I'm not saying that," he said quickly, though his eyes didn't waver. "But we need to know if you've been in contact with anyone unusual recently. Any disagreements? Someone who might want to find you?" Emily almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Her quiet life, her unremarkable days. But the laugh stuck in her chest. "No, there's no one." He studied her again, then gave a curt nod. "All right, we may have more questions later." As he walked away, Emily's hands trembled slightly. She rubbed them together, tried to shake the chill that had settled over her despite the warm afternoon air. The sounds of movement and muffled voices around the property seemed distant now, like she was hearing them through water. When she turned back toward the pool, she caught sight of a small group of neighbors who had gathered beyond the hedges, craning their necks to see what was happening. The curiosity on their faces was a thin mask over the unease. Emily started back toward the house, but another figure intercepted her, a woman in plain clothes, carrying a folder. She introduced herself as Detective Reyes. Her tone was less guarded, but no less direct. "Emily, I understand you've been here since morning," Reyes began. "I need to confirm. Have you had any packages delivered? Anything left at the gate?" Emily frowned. "No." "Why?" "There's a gap in the gate security log," Reyes said, flipping open the folder. "About 30 minutes before the first call came in, the cameras went offline for 4 minutes. When they came back, the only recorded movement was a dark sedan leaving. No plates." Emily felt her stomach drop. "And you think that's connected?" Reyes didn't answer, but she held Emily's gaze in a way that said enough. "I'm going to need you to think carefully about the last week. Anyone you didn't recognize, even small things you might have dismissed." Emily tried to recall. Faces at the grocery store, passing cars on her street, the man who'd asked her for directions 2 days ago. None of it seemed important until now. She described the man, mid-40s, baseball cap, polite, but in a hurry. Reyes wrote it down. "Anything else?" Emily shook her head. "I didn't think anything of it." "That's how they work," Reyes said quietly. You're not supposed to notice them until it's too late. The words made Emily's pulse quicken. She wanted to ask too late for what? But her voice caught. From inside the house, a voice called for Reyes. The detective closed the folder. "Stay where we can find you," she said, and disappeared through the sliding glass door. Emily stood there for a long moment, feeling the heat of the concrete under her feet and the weight of unanswered questions pressing in. Whatever this was, it was no longer just a strange incident. Someone had planned it. Someone had come here with intent. And somehow, she was at the center of it.